I learned exactly 3 things the morning Charlotte Hampton first knocked on my door. Roosters crow at 5:30 in the morning like clockwork. HOA presidents have entirely too much free time, and the phrase quality of life standards can be weaponized faster than you can say good morning. My name is Nathan Carter, and I had been living in Meadowbrook Estates in Huntsville, Alabama, for exactly 4 months when my simple farm life collided with suburban expectations. The rooster in question, a magnificent Rhode Island red named Colonel, came with the property I purchased. The previous owner, an elderly farmer named Mr. Henderson, had owned this land for 40 years before developers convinced him to sell most of it. He kept 1 acre, built a small house, and lived there with his chickens until he passed away last year. His daughter sold me the place, Colonel included, and I thought I had found paradise. The property sat on the edge of Meadowbrook Estates, technically within the community boundaries but grandfathered in with its agricultural zoning. The HOA documents I signed mentioned something about existing structures and animals being permitted to remain, which my lawyer assured me meant Colonel was safe. I should have read the fine print more carefully. Charlotte showed up that Tuesday morning wearing a cream pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight I wondered if it gave her headaches, and her smile had all the warmth of a January freeze. "Good morning," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "I'm Charlotte Hampton, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." I wiped my hands on my jeans and smiled back. "Nathan Carter, thanks for stopping by. Can I get you some coffee?" "Oh, how thoughtful, but no thank you." She glanced past me toward the chicken coop visible in my backyard. "I actually wanted to discuss a small matter with you. We've received several complaints about noise coming from your property." Colonel chose that exact moment to let out a crow that could wake the dead in 3 counties. Charlotte's eye twitched. "That would be Colonel," I said. "He's a rooster. They crow. It's kind of their thing." "Yes. Well, the thing is, Mr. Carter, we have community standards here in Meadowbrook Estates. Peace and quiet are paramount to our residents' quality of life." She pulled out a folder from her designer bag. "I'm sure you're aware of our noise ordinances." "Actually, my property is grandfathered in. The previous owner had chickens here for decades." Charlotte's smile tightened. "Circumstances change, Mr. Carter. The HOA board has been reviewing our bylaws, and we've determined that while structures may be grandfathered, the noise ordinance applies to all residents equally. No disruptive sounds before 7 a.m. or after 10 p.m. Roosters don't have alarm clocks, Mrs. Hampton. They crow when the sun rises." "Then I suggest you find a solution, because starting next week, violations will result in fines of $200 per incident." She handed me a copy of the updated bylaws. "Have a lovely day." I stood there holding the papers as she walked back to her pristine white Mercedes, her heels clicking on the driveway. The document was 30 pages long, and the noise section had been highlighted in yellow. Someone had been very thorough. That evening, I called my neighbor Tom, who lived 3 houses down and had been friendly when I moved in. He worked as a civil engineer and had lived in Meadowbrook Estates for 5 years. "Yeah, Charlotte's been on a tear lately," Tom said when I told him about the visit. "She got elected president 6 months ago and has been changing rules left and right. Last month she tried to ban basketball hoops in driveways. Before that, it was rules about what kind of mailboxes we could have. Can she actually enforce this noise thing with my rooster?" "Technically, if it's in the bylaws and you signed them when you bought the house, yes. But your grandfathered status should protect you. You might want to talk to a lawyer." I did exactly that. On Wednesday, I drove into downtown Huntsville and met with Jennifer Wu, a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes. She reviewed my documents for an hour before delivering the bad news. Your property is grandfathered for agricultural use, which is good. However, the noise ordinance is a separate issue. The HOA can argue that while you're allowed to have chickens, the noise they produce still violates community standards. That's ridiculous. How am I supposed to have a rooster that doesn't crow? You're not, which is likely their point. They want the rooster gone. Jennifer leaned back in her chair. Here's the thing, fighting this could cost you thousands in legal fees, and there's no guarantee you'd win. However, the HOA also has a weak case because your property predates their stricter bylaws. My advice, try to negotiate first. If that fails, we can fight it. Negotiating with Charlotte Hampton turned out to be exactly as productive as reasoning with a brick wall. I attended the next HOA board meeting on Thursday evening, held in the community center at the entrance of Meadowbrook Estates. About 20 residents showed up, most of them there to complain about various issues. Charlotte sat at the front table with 4 other board members. Patricia Morrison, the vice president who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. David Sung, the treasurer who barely looked up from his laptop. Rebecca Franklin, the secretary who typed everything frantically into her tablet. And Mark Stevens, the member-at-large who nodded along with everything Charlotte said. When my turn came to speak, I walked up to the microphone they'd set up and tried to keep my voice level. Hi, everyone. Nathan Carter, 2847 Oakwood Lane. I'm here about the noise ordinance and how it applies to my property. As most of you know, my land was here before this development. The rooster has been here for years. Mr. Carter, Charlotte interrupted, we've been through this. The noise ordinance is clear. But my property is grandfathered for agricultural use. Agricultural use doesn't give you license to disturb your neighbors. She looked around the room. We have 3 formal complaints from residents about your rooster. Mrs. Patterson, would you like to share? An older woman in the front row stood up. I can't sleep with that awful crowing. It wakes me up every single morning at the crack of dawn. I moved here for peace and quiet, not to live on a farm. And Mr. Brennan, Charlotte prompted, a middle-aged man in a golf shirt stood. The noise is affecting my property value. Who wants to buy a house next to a rooster? The third complaint came from a woman I didn't recognize, who claimed the crowing triggered her migraines. By the time they finished, I felt like Colonel was some kind of menace to society rather than a bird doing what birds do. The board has voted, Charlotte announced. The noise ordinance stands. You have until Monday to comply, Mr. Carter, or fines will begin accruing. $200 per violation per day. That's outrageous. He crows maybe 3 times in the morning. You're talking about $600 a day. Then I suggest you find a new home for your rooster. Charlotte's smile was triumphant. Next item on the agenda. I left that meeting furious. Tom caught up with me in the parking lot. That was rough, man. Charlotte's got it out for you. Why, I've never done anything to her. You don't fit her vision of what Meadowbrook Estates should be. She wants everyone in identical houses with identical lawns living identical lives. Your place reminds everyone that this used to be farmland, and she hates that. Over the weekend, I tried everything I could think of. I researched rooster collars that supposedly reduced crowing volume, but reviews said they were ineffective and potentially cruel. I looked into building a soundproof coop, but that would cost thousands of dollars I didn't have. I even called animal sanctuaries to see if anyone would take Colonel, but the thought of giving him up made me sick. Colonel wasn't just a rooster. He was the last living connection to Mr. Henderson's farm, to the land's history. The old man's daughter had told me stories about how her father loved that bird, how Colonel had protected the hens from hawks and foxes, how he'd been more reliable than any alarm clock. Getting rid of him felt like erasing that history completely. Monday morning arrived with Colonel's 5:30 crow right on schedule. I was already awake, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee, waiting. By Tuesday, Charlotte had apparently hired someone to document the violations, because a certified letter arrived on Wednesday informing me I owed $1,200 in fines for 6 documented instances of noise violations over 2 days. I called Jennifer Wu immediately. "File an appeal," she said. "We can drag this out while we build a case. In the meantime, don't pay the fines. That acknowledges guilt." The appeal process required submitting a written statement to the HOA board, which I did. They had 30 days to respond, which meant 30 days of mounting fines. Charlotte was clearly counting on the financial pressure to force me into compliance. What she didn't count on was the community starting to turn against her. It started with Tom, who posted about the situation on the Meadowbrook Estates Facebook group. Within hours, dozens of residents weighed in. Many supported Charlotte, calling Colonel a nuisance and me an entitled jerk who thought rules didn't apply to him. But a surprising number sided with me, pointing out that Charlotte had been overstepping her authority for months, and the Rooster was the final straw. "She fined us $300 because our grass was a 1/4 inch too tall," wrote someone named Michelle Torres. "This HOA is out of control. They made us repaint our house because the shade of beige wasn't on the approved list," added Robert Kim. "Cost us $4,000. The Facebook argument raged for days, dividing the community down the middle. Charlotte tried to shut down the discussion, but the group's moderator wasn't on the HOA board and refused to delete posts. Things got heated. People brought up old grievances, accused board members of playing favorites, and demanded Charlotte's resignation. Through it all, Colonel kept crowing every morning at 5:30 and the fines kept accumulating. By the end of the second week, I supposedly owed over $8,000. I ignored every letter, every email, every certified notice. Jennifer assured me that as long as we were in the appeal process, they couldn't put a lien on my property or take legal action. Then Charlotte made her fatal mistake. At the next HOA board meeting in early June, she proposed a new emergency alert system for the community. Meadowbrook Estates sat in Tornado Alley, and severe weather was a real concern. The system would include sirens mounted on poles throughout the neighborhood, connected to the National Weather Service, and capable of alerting residents to tornadoes, severe storms, and other emergencies. "This is about safety," Charlotte said during her presentation. "Last spring, a tornado touched down just 2 miles from here. We need to protect our residents." The proposal passed unanimously. The board allocated $30,000 from the HOA Reserve Fund for installation, and Charlotte personally oversaw the project. 6 siren poles went up over the next 3 weeks, positioned strategically throughout Meadowbrook Estates. They were tested on a Saturday afternoon in late June, producing a wailing alarm that echoed across the neighborhood. "That's incredibly loud," I mentioned to Tom, who'd come over to check out my vegetable garden. "Has to be to wake people up during a storm," he said. Though I bet Charlotte made sure they positioned the sirens as far from her house as possible. He was joking, but when I looked at the map posted on the HOA website, he was right. The 6 sirens formed a perimeter around the development, with Charlotte's house sitting in a quiet pocket in the center. The closest siren to her was nearly a 1/4 mile away. Meanwhile, my appeal hearing was scheduled for July 10th. Jennifer and I prepared a presentation about property rights, grandfathered agricultural use, and the selective enforcement of HOA rules. We had testimony from Tom and other neighbors about Charlotte's pattern of overreach. We even had a petition signed by 48 residents calling for the rooster to stay and the noise ordinance to be revised. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Charlotte and the board sat stone-faced through our entire presentation. They asked no questions, made no comments, and showed no indication they'd heard a word we said. At the end, Charlotte thanked us for our time and said the board would issue a decision within 5 business days. The decision came exactly 5 days later. Appeal denied, all fines upheld, payment due within 30 days or the HOA would pursue a lien on my property. "We expected this," Jennifer said when I called her in a panic. "Now we file in circuit court." This becomes a real legal battle and Charlotte knows it. She's betting you'll back down. I can't afford a long court fight. You might not have to. Once we file, the HOA will have to hire lawyers too, and their legal fees come from the reserve fund. That's money that could go to actual community improvements. Some board members might pressure Charlotte to settle. We filed the lawsuit on July 22nd. The local newspaper, the Huntsville Times, picked up the story. Resident sues HOA over rooster rights. It was a slow news week, and the article went mildly viral on social media. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion about my rooster. Charlotte was furious. She sent a mass email to all Meadowbrook Estates residents, claiming I was costing the community thousands in legal fees to defend my selfish insistence on disturbing the peace. She organized a petition to have Colonel removed, collecting signatures at the community pool. But something unexpected happened. The publicity brought attention to Charlotte's other controversial decisions. The Huntsville Times did a follow-up article about HOA overreach, interviewing residents who'd been fined for minor violations. They quoted Michelle Torres about her grass height fine and Robert Kim about his house painting ordeal. They found a couple who'd been fined $500 for putting up Christmas lights 2 days before the approved decorating period. The article painted Charlotte as a petty tyrant, and the court of public opinion started turning against her. More importantly, the HOA's insurance company started asking questions about why the board was pursuing such an expensive lawsuit over a rooster. In mid-August, Patricia Morrison, the vice president, called me. She sounded tired. "Mr. Carter, this is Patricia Morrison from the HOA board. I'm calling off the record to see if we can find a compromise. I'm listening. Some of us on the board think this has gone too far. The legal fees are going to drain our reserves, and frankly, the negative publicity is hurting property values more than your rooster ever could." She paused. "Charlotte is pushing hard to fight this all the way, but I think we could get 3 votes to settle if you'd agree to some reasonable accommodation." "What kind of accommodation?" "What if we revised the noise ordinance to allow agricultural sounds from grandfathered properties between 5 a.m. and 11 p.m. Your rooster crows around 5:30, right? That would make it legal." It was more than I expected. "I'd agree to that. Let me work on the other board members. I'll get back to you." She never got the chance. 3 days later, everything changed. August 19th started as a normal summer day in Alabama. Hot, humid, with afternoon thunderstorms in the forecast. I spent the morning working in my garden while Colonel supervised from his favorite perch on the coop fence. Around 2 in the afternoon, the sky started looking ominous. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. I checked the weather radar on my phone and saw a massive storm system moving through. Severe thunderstorm warnings were up for Madison County, with reports of rotation in some of the cells. I brought Colonel and the hens into their coop and headed inside. By 4 o'clock, the sky had turned an eerie green color. The wind picked up, bending trees almost double. My phone buzzed with a tornado warning. A confirmed tornado on the ground, moving northeast toward Huntsville, expected to impact the Meadowbrook Estates area within 20 minutes. I grabbed my emergency kit and headed for my basement. As I descended the stairs, I realized something was wrong. The emergency sirens should have been wailing by now. The tornado warning had been active for 5 minutes, and the system was supposed to activate automatically when the National Weather Service issued warnings for our area. I waited in the basement, listening to the wind howl above me. Still no sirens. I pulled up the Meadowbrook Estates Facebook group on my phone and saw people posting frantically. Why aren't the emergency sirens going off? Is anyone else not hearing the alarms? We have a tornado warning. Where are the sirens? Then someone posted, I drove past one of the siren poles and the control box is open. Looks like it's been vandalized or something. My stomach dropped. I tried calling 911 to report the non-functioning sirens, but the lines were jammed with emergency calls. The tornado was getting closer. I could hear the roar now like a freight train approaching. And then, cutting through the storm noise, I heard it. Colonel crowing from his coop. The rooster had apparently decided that the weird dark sky and chaos meant it was time for another round of territorial announcements. His crow echoed across my property and into the neighboring yards. In the stillness before the tornado hit, that sound carried. Later, I would learn that Colonel's crowing woke up at least 15 people in Meadowbrook Estates who'd been napping through the storm. The Pattersons, who lived closest to me and had complained most loudly about the noise, were among them. Mrs. Patterson told the news later that she'd been sleeping off a headache when the crowing startled her awake. She checked her phone, saw the tornado warning, and got her family to their safe room just minutes before the tornado hit. The tornado itself was an EF2, packing winds up to 130 miles per hour. It touched down about a mile west of Meadowbrook Estates and carved a path of destruction through the area. It didn't make a direct hit on our neighborhood, but it passed close enough to cause significant damage. Trees came down, roofs were torn off, windows shattered. The community center where Charlotte held her HOA meetings was completely destroyed. I stayed in my basement for 30 minutes after the all clear, then emerged to survey the damage. My house had lost some shingles and a tree had fallen in my backyard, missing the chicken coop by about 10 feet. Colonel and his hens were shaken but safe. The neighborhood looked like a war zone. Debris everywhere, downed power lines, damaged houses. Emergency vehicles were already arriving, sirens wailing in a bitter irony given that our own warning system had failed. I grabbed my chainsaw and work gloves and started helping neighbors clear fallen trees from driveways. Tom appeared with his own equipment, and soon a dozen of us were working together, clearing debris and checking on elderly residents. That's when we found Charlotte. She lived in one of the larger houses near the center of the development, a 2-story colonial with a circular driveway. The tornado had taken most of her roof and dropped a massive oak tree across her garage. Charlotte sat on her front steps in shock, staring at the destruction. Patricia Morrison was with her and several other neighbors. As I approached, I heard Charlotte saying, "I didn't hear anything." No warnings, no sirens, nothing. I was in my office and the windows just exploded. "The emergency sirens never went off," Patricia said quietly. "None of them." "That's impossible. We just installed them. We tested them." "Charlotte, they didn't work. People are saying they were vandalized." I didn't say anything, Just started helping clear the tree from her driveway. Charlotte watched me work, her face pale, over the next several hours as emergency crews worked through the neighborhood and residents emerged to assess damage. A clear picture formed. The tornado had caused significant property damage, but no serious injuries. Several people credited Colonel's crowing with waking them up and giving them time to take shelter. Mrs. Patterson actually sought me out that evening, finding me back at my house as I patched a hole in my roof with a tarp. "Mr. Carter, I wanted to thank you." Her voice was quiet. "Your rooster's crowing woke me up. I had no idea there was a tornado warning. Our phones were on silent and we were both sleeping. If I hadn't woken up—" She didn't finish the sentence. Her husband stood behind her, nodding. "We're sorry we complained," he said. "About the noise. We were wrong." Similar conversations happened across the neighborhood that night and over the next few days. Robert Kim stopped by with a 6-pack of beer. Michelle Torres brought over a casserole. Even people who'd never spoken to me before came by to thank me or apologize. The question of what happened to the emergency sirens became the focus of an investigation. The Huntsville Police Department sent officers to examine the system. What they found was damning. Someone had deliberately disabled all 6 sirens. The control boxes had been opened with a key, and the main power connections had been disconnected. It wasn't vandalism by random troublemakers. Someone with authorized access had sabotaged the system. There were only 3 people with keys to the siren control boxes: Charlotte Hampton, David Sung the treasurer, and the security manager Charlotte had hired to oversee the system. The security manager, a retired fire chief named William Torres, was interviewed first. He had a solid alibi. He'd been in Florida visiting his daughter for the past week, with plane tickets and hotel receipts to prove it. David Sung had been at work in Birmingham the day the sirens were disabled, with dozens of witnesses and security camera footage confirming it. That left Charlotte. At first, she denied everything. She claimed she'd never touched the sirens after installation, never opened the control boxes, had no reason to disable a safety system she'd championed. But investigators kept digging, and what they found painted a disturbing picture. A resident who lived near one of the siren poles came forward with security camera footage from her home. The camera, mounted to monitor her driveway, had a partial view of the nearest siren pole. On August 16th, 3 days before the tornado, the footage showed Charlotte's white Mercedes pulling up to the pole. Charlotte got out, opened the control box with a key, and spent about 10 minutes working inside before closing it and driving away. The footage showed her visiting 3 different siren poles that day, staying about 10 minutes at each location. When police matched the timestamps to the other siren locations, they found similar gaps in Charlotte's schedule. Cell phone tower data put her in the vicinity of all 6 sirens during the time frame when they'd been disabled. When confronted with this evidence, Charlotte finally admitted what she'd done, but insisted she'd had good reasons. "The sirens were too loud," she told the police. "They were disturbing the peace, especially during the test cycles. I was getting complaints from residents. I just disconnected them temporarily while we explored moving them to different locations where the noise wouldn't be as disruptive." "You disabled emergency warning systems during tornado season because they were too loud?" the investigating officer asked incredulously. "I was going to reconnect them. I just needed time to convince the board to reposition them. It was only supposed to be for a few days." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Charlotte had fought so hard to silence my rooster in the name of noise control that she'd disabled actual emergency sirens for the same reason. The difference was that my rooster had ended up saving lives while her actions had put the entire community at risk. The Madison County District Attorney charged Charlotte with 6 counts of tampering with a public safety system, a felony under Alabama law. The fact that her actions had directly prevented tornado warnings from reaching residents during an actual emergency made the charges more severe. She faced up to 10 years in prison per count. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Charlotte as president and from the board entirely. Patricia Morrison became acting president. One of her first acts was to settle my lawsuit, agreeing to revise the noise ordinance to exempt grandfathered agricultural properties and refund all the fines I'd been assessed. "We owe you more than an apology," Patricia said when she brought me the settlement papers. "Your rooster literally saved lives while our president was sabotaging our safety systems. The whole board is ashamed we let things get this far." The story became national news for a few days. HOA president arrested after disabling tornado sirens over noise complaints ran in newspapers across the country. Cable news picked it up as a cautionary tale about HOAs run amok. Someone even made a GoFundMe for Colonel that raised $5,000, which I donated to tornado relief efforts in Huntsville. Charlotte's trial took place in November. Her lawyer tried to argue that she'd made a mistake in judgment, but never intended to harm anyone. The prosecution countered that she deliberately disabled life-saving equipment out of obsession with noise control, putting hundreds of people at risk. They brought in Mrs. Patterson and 14 other residents who testified that Colonel's crowing had alerted them to danger when the official systems failed. The jury found Charlotte guilty on all 6 counts. The judge, citing the severe weather risk she'd created and the fact that people could have died, sentenced her to 3 years in state prison, with credit for time served and possibility of parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the HOA for the cost of repairing the siren system and legal fees. As Charlotte was led out of the courtroom, she looked over at me one last time. I expected anger or blame, but what I saw was something closer to exhaustion and regret. She'd let her obsession with control destroy her life over a rooster crowing at sunrise. Life in Meadowbrook Estates gradually returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. The community came together in the aftermath of the tornado, rebuilding damaged homes and replanting fallen trees. The emergency siren system was repaired and upgraded with redundant safety features to prevent future tampering. Patricia proved to be a much more reasonable HOA president. She organized a community vote to revise the most controversial bylaws, and residents overwhelmingly supported loosening many of Charlotte's strict rules. The grass height requirement was relaxed, the approved paint color list was expanded, and basketball hoops were officially allowed in driveways. The noise ordinance was completely rewritten. Agricultural sounds from grandfathered properties were explicitly permitted at any hour. The new rules also included exceptions for children playing, holiday celebrations, and emergency situations. It wasn't perfect, but it recognized that communities are made up of people living real lives, not identical units to be regulated into submission. Colonel became something of a neighborhood celebrity. People who'd never met me would wave when they drove past my property. Parents brought kids by to see the famous rooster who'd warned everyone about the tornado. Someone painted a small mural of a rooster on the new community center wall, and while it didn't look much like Colonel, I appreciated the gesture. Mrs. Patterson and I became unlikely friends. She started buying eggs from me weekly and admitted that she'd actually grown fond of Colonel's morning crow. "It's reassuring," she said. "Means everything's normal." Tom and I built a new, reinforced chicken coop to replace the old one, designed to withstand high winds and falling debris. We added more hens too, and Colonel took his role as protector of an expanded flock very seriously. He still crowed at 5:30 every morning, reliable as sunrise. Jennifer Wu sent me a final bill for her legal services with "paid in full" stamped across it. She'd been paid from the settlement, but she also included a note. "Thanks for the most interesting case of my career. Colonel's welcome in my courtroom anytime." The other HOA board members gradually rotated off over the next year. David Sung moved to California for a job opportunity. Rebecca Franklin's term expired, and she chose not to run again. Mark Stevens resigned after admitting he'd just gone along with Charlotte because it was easier than arguing. They were replaced by residents who actually cared about the community rather than controlling it. One unexpected outcome was that Meadowbrook Estates became known as one of the more laid-back developments in Huntsville. People who were tired of strict HOA rules sought out homes in our neighborhood. Property values, which Charlotte had been so worried about, actually increased because people valued the community's reasonable approach. I settled into a comfortable routine. Work, garden, chickens, neighbors. I started dating Michelle Torres, the woman who'd been fined for her grass height. She thought the whole Rooster situation was hilarious and loved Colonel almost as much as I did. We'd sit on my porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and listening to the chickens settle in for the night. Sometimes I thought about Charlotte, sitting in a prison cell because she couldn't tolerate the sound of a rooster crowing. She'd had a good life, a beautiful home, a community that initially respected her. She'd thrown it all away because she couldn't accept that some things were beyond her control. The Weather Service issued a few more tornado warnings over the next couple of years, and each time the emergency sirens worked perfectly, wailing their alert across Meadowbrook Estates. And each time, long before the sirens activated, Colonel would crow his own warning as the barometric pressure dropped and the sky turned strange colors. The birds always know first. On the 2-year anniversary of the tornado, the community held a memorial event at the rebuilt community center. We planted 6 oak trees to replace the ones lost in the storm and installed a plaque recognizing the residents who'd helped with recovery efforts. Patricia gave a speech about community resilience and learning from mistakes. At the end of the ceremony, she called me up to the front. I hadn't expected this and felt awkward as I walked up to join her. "Nathan Carter and his Rooster Colonel have become symbols of our community," Patricia said. "Not because of the controversy or the news stories, but because they reminded us what really matters. Neighbors looking out for each other, common sense over rigid rules, and sometimes the things we find most annoying might turn out to be exactly what we need." She presented me with a framed resolution from the HOA board, officially declaring Colonel an honorary member of Meadowbrook Estates and thanking him for his distinguished service in community alertness and emergency notification. Everyone applauded, and I had to admit, I got a little choked up. That evening, Tom and his family came over for a barbecue. Michelle brought her famous potato salad. The Pattersons stopped by with homemade ice cream. Other neighbors drifted over as word spread, and soon my backyard was full of people eating, laughing, and sharing stories. Colonel presided over it all from his perch, occasionally crowing as if to remind everyone he was still on duty. Kids chased fireflies while adults sat in lawn chairs, watching the stars come out. This was what community was supposed to be: messy, loud, real, and alive. Around 10 o'clock, as people started heading home, Mrs. Patterson came over to say goodnight. "You know what I realized," she said. "That first morning Colonel woke me up, I was so angry. I thought, this rooster is ruining my peace and quiet. But I wasn't at peace. I was just hiding from life, sleeping through everything, trying to control every little thing in my environment. Colonel didn't ruin my peace. He woke me up to actually living. I thought about that after everyone left, as I locked up the chickens for the night. Colonel settled onto his roost, his hens around him, his job done for the day. In 12 hours he'd crow again, greeting the dawn like he'd done for years, like he'd do for years to come. Charlotte had seen that crow as a problem to be eliminated, a deviation from her perfect vision of controlled suburban life. She'd been so focused on silence that she'd created genuine danger, so obsessed with order that she'd brought chaos. In trying to silence one rooster, she'd ended up silencing emergency sirens that could have saved lives. But Colonel kept crowing, kept doing what roosters do, kept marking time and warning of danger, and reminding everyone that life happens on its own schedule, not according to HOA bylaws. I never regretted keeping him. Not during the complaints, not during the fines, not during the lawsuit. Because in the end, that stubborn rooster who refused to be silenced had taught an entire community something important. Sometimes the noise we try so hard to eliminate is exactly the sound we need to hear. The last I heard, Charlotte was granted parole after serving 16 months. She moved to Arizona to live with her sister, far from Meadowbrook Estates and the memories of what her obsession had cost her. I hoped she found peace there, the real kind that comes from acceptance rather than control. As for me, I'm still here on my 1 acre at the edge of Meadowbrook Estates, with my garden and my chickens and my rooster who greets every morning like it's the first dawn of creation. Michelle and I got married last spring in my backyard, with Colonel providing a running commentary throughout the ceremony that had everyone laughing. We're thinking about getting a few goats next year. The new HOA bylaws specifically allow agricultural animals on grandfathered properties, and Patricia already approved the idea. Some of the neighbors are worried about the noise, but most of them just laugh and say it can't be worse than Colonel. They're probably right. Colonel sets a high bar for agricultural alarm systems. Every morning at 5:30, like clockwork, he crows. And every morning, I smile and start the coffee, grateful for the sound that reminds me I'm alive, I'm home, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The community has learned to set their clocks by him, to appreciate the rhythm he provides to their days. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the weather's nice, I sit on my porch and think about how differently things could have turned out. If I'd given up Colonel when Charlotte first demanded it, if I'd paid the fines and accepted defeat, if I'd let the HOA's pressure force me into compliance. The tornado would have come either way, but without Colonel's warning, without the sirens that Charlotte had disabled, how many people might not have made it to safety? I think about the chain of events that started with one woman's complaint about noise and ended with her in prison, a community transformed, and a rooster celebrated as a hero. Life is strange that way. The smallest actions ripple outward in ways we can never predict. Tom stops by most weekends now, and we've started a tradition of Saturday morning coffee on my porch. We sit there, drinking our coffee, listening to the neighborhood wake up, and solving the world's problems in the way middle-aged men do. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd just gotten rid of Colonel?" he asked me one morning. "Every day," I said. "But then I remember Mr. Henderson, the old farmer who lived here before me. His daughter told me he'd say that roosters don't crow to annoy people. They crow because it's their nature, their purpose. Trying to silence that is trying to silence life itself. That's pretty philosophical for before 6 in the morning. Colonel brings out my contemplative side. We laughed, and Colonel, hearing his name, let out another crow from the coop. Right on schedule, doing exactly what he was meant to do, unbothered by HOA rules or noise ordinances, or anyone's opinion of when birds should and shouldn't make noise. That's the thing about nature, about life, about the world beyond our controlled suburban bubbles. It doesn't care about our bylaws and regulations. Roosters crow at dawn. Storms come when they come. Tornadoes don't check the HOA calendar before touching down. And sometimes, the very thing we try hardest to eliminate ends up being exactly what saves us. Meadowbrook Estates learned that lesson the hard way, but at least we learned it. We're better for it now. More human, more real, more willing to accept the messy, noisy, unpredictable reality of living in community with each other and with the natural world. And every morning, when Colonel crows at 5:30, I think of Charlotte sitting in her pristine house with her rigid rules, so terrified of disorder that she created disaster. I think of Mrs. Patterson waking up to that crow with just enough time to get her family to safety. I think of all the people who complained about the noise and then thanked me for it. Mostly, though, I just think about how lucky I am. Lucky to have this land, this house, these chickens. Lucky to have found Michelle and Tom and all the other neighbors who became friends. Lucky to have fought for what mattered and won. Not just the legal battle, but the harder fight to maintain my principles against pressure to conform. Colonel's getting older now. Roosters can live 8 to 10 years, and he's already past 6. Someday, probably sooner than I want to think about, there will be a morning when he doesn't crow. When that day comes, the neighborhood will notice. People will realize how much they'd come to depend on that sound to find comfort in its reliability. But that day isn't today. Today, Colonel is still on duty, still greeting the dawn, still protecting his hens and marking time and serving as Meadowbrook Estates' unofficial and most famous alarm system. Today, the sun rises over Alabama farmland that became suburban development but never quite forgot its roots. Today, life continues in all its messy, noisy, beautiful chaos. And tomorrow morning at 5:30, Colonel will crow again, because that's what roosters do. That's what they've always done. That's what they'll always do, bylaws be damned. I wouldn't have it any other way.